Of the Rambam's translator, of Shmuel ibn Tibon. So you'll recall that he made a lot of discussion of the pasuk in, once again, Perek Tes of Yirmiyahu, which talks about what should a person take pride in, meaning what is the purpose of life, what is the accomplishment of life. So it mentions three things that a person should not take pride in, that the Chacham should not be proud of his wisdom, and the strong person should not be proud of his strength, and the Asher should not be proud of his wealth. But what should one be proud in? Of course, in a modest way. Haskel v'yadua osi, to know me, to know God, because I am the God that does mishpat, justice, chesed, loving kindness, tzedakah, ki bi'ela chafatzti, and this is what I want. So here is the connection. I just want to point out an important point, that the way Rav Shmuel ibn Tibon translates the pasuk is actually saying that Chacham does not mean a wise person who knows a lot of things, because fakert, if you say that, you have a contradiction, because the pasuk says, don't take pride in your wisdom, and then says, what you should take pride in is your understanding. Well, that's the same thing. So rather, he learns, do not take pride in your wisdom, meaning to say, wisdom in the reisha of the pasuk, the beginning of the pasuk, means midos tovos. Chachma means midos tovos, and even though that is a good thing, that is not an end in and of itself. That's a big chiddush. Some would disagree with that. Midos tovos is not an end in itself. Now, someone asked yesterday, if Chachma is a good thing that can bring you to Hashem, then that implies the other two things can also bring you to Hashem, Gibor and Ashiras, but they're only a means to an end. So the question was raised, how does that bring you to Hashem? So I just want to supplement a little bit. The answer I gave was that perhaps Gevura, strength, might refer to health, and when a person is healthy, they're able to concentrate better. And Asher also means you're not poor, so you're able to, you're less distracted by the worries of Parnasa. But I was thinking there may be an alternative explanation, because Pirkei Avos actually gives us a definition for the three terms of Chacham, Gibor, and Asher. And the three terms are, who is a Chacham, Halomed Mikol Adam, who learns from everybody. Now, granted, Shmuel ibn Tibon is not using that definition of Chacham, because it says Chacham means good midas, but it could be that for the other two, he is using the Pirkei Avos definition, and that is a Gibor is one who conquers the Yetzer Hara, and an Asher is a person that is Somayach B'chelkei. So all three are very good. The Chacham are good midos generally. The Gibor is the one with the discipline to conquer his Yetzer Hara. The Asher is the one that is Sameach, that is happy in his lot. So all three are very good. But the point of the pasuk is, they are a means to an end, and not an end. Big chiddush. Good midos, conquering the Yetzer Hara, Sameach b'chelkei. They're gavaldik. They're not trivial. They're not being dismissed, as you might understand the pasuk. But rather, they are not ends in and of itself. The end in and of itself is to know God, and that means to understand the ways of Hashem to the degree that's possible for us to understand it, to be convinced of Hashem's existence through logic and understanding, and not just through blind faith. And when it says, Ki be'ela chafatzti, it is this that I desire, it means knowing God is what I desire. Which means, according to Rav Shmuel ibn Tibon's understanding of the pasuk is not directly saying that midos tovos are good. We supply that. In other words, it's basically saying your midos are not ends in of itself. The end goal is to know God. He then says it happens to be that you have to perfect your midos in order to know God, because bad midos are like a mechitza, are like a wall that block you. And that's why you have to perfect my midas. Why do I have to be kind? Why do I have to be generous? Why do I have to be even-tempered? Why do I have to be benevolent? Because that removes the barriers that prevent me from Yedias Hashem. But the point I want you to see is that premise is an unstated premise in the pasuk. The pasuk does not directly say, perfect your midos. The pasuk is saying the opposite. Don't take pride in your midos, etc. Take pride only in your knowledge of God. We then say, oh yeah, but the only way you'll know God is by perfecting your midos. But that part is parentheses. That part is not in the pasuk itself, strangely enough. Now I want to point out that there is a whole other way of, in other words, the phrase, ki be'ela chafatzti, in this I desire, is going back on haskel v'yadua osi, to know God. But some Meforshim learned the pasuk very differently. And the pasuk is conveying actually a different message. It's saying, a wise person shouldn't be proud of his wisdom. That means if you're smart, doesn't mean anything. And if you're physically strong, doesn't mean anything. And if you're wealthy, it doesn't mean anything. What counts? To know God who does mishpat, justice, chesed, tzedakah, ki ba'ela chafatzti, in these is what I desire. It's not going back on knowing God. What God desires is the mishpat, the chesed, and the tzedakah. Do you see the difference here? Maybe if we would have had a PowerPoint, we'd see the pasuk on a board or a screen or something. Ki be'ela, in these I desire. What is the these? According to Shmuel ibn Tibon, in these is going on haskel v'yodeo. See, the thing I desire is that you know God. And the midos are just seen as a means to that end. And even that's unstated. That's unstated in the verse. According to the other pshat, ki be'ela chafatzti is going back on, I am the God who does justice, loving kindness, and charity. Ki be'ela chafatzti, in these I desire. What is the these? Not knowing God. In these I desire is justice, kindness, and charity. That's a very different understanding of the pasuk. In other words, the pasuk, under that understanding, is not emphasizing the highest goal as knowing God. Rather, the highest goal is perfecting your midas. What Ibn Tibon kind of denigrated by saying, oh, the wise person shouldn't be happy in his wisdom, which he interpreted as midos tovos. According to this other pshat, that is exactly what a person should have joy in, the perfection of his midos, in which he exhibits in his life chesed and tzedakah and mishpat. So there may not be a practical difference here, because under all interpretations, we must perfect our midos, and we must work on our midos. That's a given. Nobody is saying, oh, forget about midos, not important. But according to the Ibn Tibon interpretation, perfection of midos is a means towards a higher end of what is called knowledge of God. According to the other interpretation, perfection of midos is the very thing that Hashem wants. Hashem wants the perfection of midos. Now there's ki be'ela chafatzti, in these I desire, is not going back on, I desire that you know me. Rather, in these I desire the mishpat, the tzedakah, and the chesed. So you really do have two different ideas here. Is the perfection of midos something that is intrinsically treasured by Hashem? Or is it the hechi timsa? Is it the means by which one comes to Yedias Hashem? And Yedias Hashem is the ultimate goal. Now, this actually may connect with another issue that the Rambam himself will discuss later. And philosophers call this action ethic versus virtue ethic. And that is the following. There are two different ways we can envision the importance of midos tovos. One way of envisioning it is that Hashem's goal is that we should help people. People are poor, we should help. We should give chizuk. So memela, I have to have good midos, because the good midos will enable me to do good action. And ultimately, the shevach is the action that you do, and the perfection of character is the way that you will come to do virtuous action. But the ikar is the virtuous action, which would mean, according to that idea, if you're on a desert island and there's literally nobody around for you to help, there would be no purpose in cultivating good midos, because the midos are not going to be turned into any type of virtuous action. I mean, you might get rescued, okay, but just in terms of the actual situation of, if there's nobody around to help, why should I cultivate some midah of rachamim? What's the point of having rachamim if it's not going to turn into acts of rachamim? But virtue ethic says the other way around, that there's inherently a value in midos tovos, even if they do not translate into action, because they are the stepping stone of your ability to know God. So if you look at the purpose of midos tovos as the performance of virtuous action, that would be called an action ethic. Then, when there's no virtuous action to be performed, your midos, there's no reason to work on your midos in any way. Like, why should I cultivate compassion for other human beings if I'm never going to see another human being? If, on the other hand, you look at midos tovos as the removal of mechitzos, the removal of barriers that prevent you from connecting to God, then even if you're locked in a prison cell, you're all by yourself. I work on my midos tovos because I want to come to the level of Yedias Hashem. So that is called a virtue ethic, meaning to say there is an inherent maila in virtue even when it is not translated into action. And in fact, the relationship of midos and action could actually be understood in opposite ways. Is it that good midos produce good action? Or is it that good action can help create good midos? Meaning to say, what's your means and what's your goal? Because both are true, right? The more good actions I do, that can redefine my character. So do I give tzedakah because I want to help the poor person? Or do I give tzedakah because it makes me a more benevolent, compassionate person who can know Hashem on a higher level? Meaning, is the giving of the tzedakah a means to the tikkun hamidos? Or is the tikkun hamidos a means towards the giving of tzedakah? What's the goal? Now, this may sound a little strange. According to Shmuel ibn Tibon, which may be the Rambam's view, we'll see, the reason why I give tzedakah to a poor person is to develop within me the trait of benevolence, which will make me more able to have a Yedias Hashem. So the action is directing me in the paths of virtue, as opposed to the idea that I work on my virtue so I will do a virtuous action. In fact, let me just give you one particular example that the Rambam himself gives. So I'm going beyond the translator's Hakdama here. Let's imagine that you have $100. So the Rambam says, is it better to give the $100 to one ani, or to give 100 different aniyim $1 or 1 penny? So the Rambam says that if you're trying to develop the capacity of generosity and the capacity of rachamim, the Rambam says you develop those capacities by repetitive actions. And the Rambam says 100 small repetitive actions make a bigger impression on your character than one big dramatic action. Meaning the fact that I gave tzedakah 100 times is going to have a bigger hashpah on my midos than if I gave $100 once. And therefore the Rambam recommends, as a character builder, you do repetitive actions over and over and over and over again, as opposed to one big action. Now, here's the thing. If you looked at Tikkun HaMidos as primarily because of the good action you're going to do, the truth of the matter is $100 to one person is going to do a lot more good, actually, than $1 to each person. I give $1 to 100 people. What do they get What do they get from it? They don't get that much from it. I give $100 to a person, so whatever, he could make a payment on his rent, he could get groceries. So if you looked at the action as the ultimate tachlis, we might have thought, do it in a way that does the most good. But if you look at action as means of building character, then you have the Rambam's point that small repetitive actions make a bigger impression on you than one big action. So in a sense, I think the Rambam and Rav Shmuel Ibn Tibon are marching in the same way, indeed you'd expect that, in which Tikkun HaMidos is designed to facilitate your Yedias Hashem, and virtuous actions are ways that are misaken midas. And again, this itself is a very important idea that many Rishonim say, especially the Sefer HaChinuch, that Adam nifal kefi pu'ulosav, meaning instead of looking at our emotions as causing our actions, which of course they do, the actions can create the emotions. In other words, I act generously, I will become a more generous person. So it's a funny inversion, meaning the reason why I'm supposed to be kind is not so I will help the poor. It's the other way around. The reason I help the poor is to develop within me the capacity for kindness. It's kind of maybe the opposite of the way we normally look at it. And again, I say not all commentaries will look at it this way, but it goes back to the idea that Tikkun HaMidos is praised not because of the chesed it does for others, but because it removes the mechitzos that lets you have Yedias Hashem, and it's Yedias Hashem that is the goal. Yeah.
Is there a difference between Breitowitz and Yedias Hashem?
Yeah, so this is a hard thing, exactly, because the truth is that we talk about Yedias Hashem over and over, and we don't really see what Yedias Hashem is. It seems to be Yedias Hashem has a few different components that overlap. One is the intellectual understanding that there is a God, that I know there's a God not because of blind faith and not because my teachers or my parents taught me, but I know by looking at the Bria that there is a God. It also appears that Yediah can refer to a certain intimacy of Dveikus, because again, let me point out, when Adam is together with Chava, so the Torah uses the word, and Adam yada, Adam knew Chava, his wife. Right? That's the phrase carnal knowledge. Now, that's a strange phrase. Why do you, if you're talking about marital intimacy, why do you call it knowing? Adam knew Chava, his wife. So you see that the word yediah, true knowledge, connotes an intimacy and a connection. So by analogy to the carnal knowledge of Adam knowing Chava, I think you might very well say Yedias Hashem. Yedias Hashem is not just an intellectual knowing of God, but it's an emotional connection and binding with God. But you got to remove the junk. You got to remove the mechitzas. You got to remove the barriers. And midos ra'os are barriers that prevent the chibur. Number one, they affect the clarity of your mind, which is a strange thing. We wouldn't automatically apply that to physics or mathematics, right? You could be a pretty bad guy and still be a brilliant physicist, I'm assuming. But in terms of knowing God, it's going to affect the clarity of your mind. And number two, you obviously will not develop a loving, intimate relationship with Hashem when you have all of these barriers. Yeah?
In terms of developing good middos to get closer in understanding with Hashem, in your experience, what do you think are like middos that are often like overlooked?
Yeah, so again, we'll get into it as we go on, but basically arrogance is a very, very major one, and anger. So I would say arrogance and anger, gaiva and kas, are two very, very big ones. And on the positive side, humility and gratitude would be things that can bring you closer to Hashem. But again, there are many, middos have a wide variety of things. But if you want to work on one or two, those would be the big ones to work on. Yeah.
How does the Rambam explain the idea that like you're seemingly using others in order to gain your closeness to Hashem?
Yeah, it's a difficulty, and the truth of the matter is, I don't think the Rambam's comment in Pirkei Avos is even meant to be a halacha, meaning to say, if you have $100 to give, you should probably give it where it does the most good and not give a penny to 1,000 people. The Rambam was just saying, if your goal would be character development, then it's better to give a penny to 1,000 people. But ein achinami, there may be other goals in tzedakah, namely the chesed that you do. You are correct. I mean, this understanding of chesed is great because it makes me a better person. By making me a better person, I can now have Yediyas Hashem. It sounds almost kind of a little selfish. I'm using other people to advance my olam haba. It is a good question. It's a complicated issue. Apparently, there are both ideas there. In fact, there's a famous vort from the Sfas Emes. The Sfas Emes points out, why do we not make a bracha on mitzvos bein adam lechavero? For example, when you give tzedakah, why don't you make a bracha asher kiddishanu b'mitzvosav v'tzivanu l'sei tzedakah? When you honor your parents, right? Your mother asked you to make her a cup of coffee or tea. So why don't you say, Asher kiddishanu mitzvosanu l'chabed aviyim, right? The general rule is, we only make brachos on bein adam lamakom, between man and God. Tzitzis, tefillin. We don't make brachos bein adam l'chavero, right? So the Sfas Emes says an interesting thing. Because in a bracha bein adam l'chavero, it's a strange thing. You shouldn't be doing it only because God commanded. You're mechuyev to develop a midah where I want to help you. I want to honor my parents. When a person makes a bracha, it's almost as if they're saying, I wouldn't do this, God, except for the fact that you commanded me. Now that's true for tefillin. If God didn't command me to wear tefillin, I wouldn't think of it myself. But what do I say? I say, my mother asked me to get her a cup of tea. She said, okay, Mom, God commanded me to do it, so I guess I got to do it. It's fakert from the whole idea. The whole idea is Hashem wants you to develop a personality in which you want to do good to another person. And if you're only doing it because it's a mitzvah, that is actually a chisaron. That's more egotistical. That's a chisaron in the Ben Adam L'Chaver. In fact, they tell a story which goes the opposite direction, actually. I'll tell you a story. Some people absolutely hate this story, but I'll tell you the story. It's an old Hasidic story about a Rebbe. I don't know. I don't know who the Rebbe was. It's kind of an anonymous Rebbe story, in which this Rebbe was an extremely generous person, and like every bit of money he ever got, he gave to tzedakah. He gave like 100% to tzedakah. And then one day, he stopped giving anything. He just stopped giving. He wouldn't give anything. And this went on for 6 months. And after 6 months, he went back to his old ways. So somebody asked him, what's going on? He says, well, listen, I want to give tzedakah because it's the Ratzon Hashem. The opposite of the Sfas Emes. I want to give tzedakah as Hashem commanded. But my problem was I felt so much rachamim for people that I was giving tzedakah because of my rachamim. I wasn't serving Hashem, I was giving into my rachamim. So he said, this is the part that can rub you the wrong way, I wanted to destroy my Rachmanis. I wanted to become cruel and mean and uncaring. So I stopped giving and I let people suffer. And then he said, and when I stopped caring about people, then I said, now I'm going to give the same stuff I always gave, l'shem shamayim. Some people, think that's an awful story. I actually also think it's an awful story, because I think it's certainly fakert from the Rambam. Because if the Rambam is saying the purpose of giving is that you develop a midah of kindness, so to say, no, I want to serve Hashem by not feeling the pain for others, right? You're missing the whole point, right? So, like the Sfas Emes fakert, the whole mitzvah of ben adam l'chaverei is that you should be margish, right? You don't say, I'm doing it l'shem shamayim. I mean, of course, you are doing it l'shem shamayim, but it has to be accompanied with that genuine feeling. Yeah.
Is it possible to say that we approve the idea midos aren't necessarily the end goal? Because you can have a person with really good midos but doesn't necessarily believe in Hashem?
Yeah, so that would be an inyan too, because you are correct. People say often, one of the arguments that we use in the Kiruv world, and actually goes back to Dostoevsky, who said it first, in Crime and Punishment. So Raskolnikov, remember the protagonist in Crime and Punishment, made the point that without God, all things are permitted. Meaning, say, if you don't believe in God, then what basis do you have to be moral? Why can't you kill? Why can't you steal? Right? I mean, why not? If you have something I want, why shouldn't I take it? If I believe in God, so God says not to. If God says not to, then if there's no God, what's the problem? Meaning, there is no basis for morality without God. Now, what does that mean practically? Does that mean every atheist is a rapist, murderer? Now granted, I may have had many issues with Christopher Hitchens, but I can tell you he was not a murderer or a rapist. There are plenty of atheists who are nice people. Right? So to make the claim, this is an example of oversell in Kiruv sometimes, to make the claim that if you are an atheist, you can't possibly have morality, is a false claim, because atheists do have morality. But I think there is a legitimate issue. Okay, you have morality, but what basis do you have morality? That's a good kasha, meaning to say, why are you moral? Why? Good. I know you don't kill, I know you don't rape, I know you don't rob. You're a nice guy. But I don't understand why you don't. And if the atheist ponders that, I think he'll realize he ultimately does not have an answer. And therefore, I would submit, although I can't necessarily say I have a controlled experiment, that under conditions of extreme pressure, at some point the atheist will give up the value system. In other words, if it's a question of survival or whatever it would be, because there is no basis. As long as life is going okay, so why should, if I'm not a sociopath, if I'm not a psychopath, why should I kill, rape, or steal? So the average person goes through life without doing any of those things. But at the point at which it becomes to your advantage, without a belief in God, there's really nothing that's holding you back from the most extreme depravities and the like. So you do have a point that when midos tovos are not connected to a belief in Hashem, to a yedias Hashem, the midos themselves can be temporary and they can break under pressure and the like. See, that much is a true statement. I mean, when people start saying, "Oh, atheists aren't moral," that I would not agree with. But atheists don't have a basis for morality, I think, is actually a much stronger argument. Okay, alrighty. So this is the interesting thing about midos tovos, and again, let me bring another point that Rev Ibn Tibon brings in. He quotes a Gemara in, one second here, let me find it. Haiman de boy lahavi chasida. if you want to be a chassid, no, I'm sorry. This is already the Rambam. I'm sorry. Now we're beginning the Rambam. Okay, so we did the Hakdama of Shmuel ibn Tibon. Now we begin the Rambam. But the Rambam's Hakdama to Pirkei Avos are called the 8 Prakim. But the Rambam wrote a Hakdama to his Hakdama. So there's right? So we're going in pieces here. We did yesterday and today the Hakdama of the translator. Now we're going to look at the Hakdama of the Rambam to his Hakdama, which is called Shmona Prakim. And in the Rambam's Hakdama to his Hakdama called Shmona Prakim, he brings a Gemara in Bava Kama, Daf Lamed. And the Gemara in Bava Kama says, Hai man de boy lemahave chasida. He who wants to be a chassid, L'kayim milei the Avos. He should fulfill the words of Pirkei Avos. Now, when the Gemara says chassid, the Gemara does not mean Chabad or Satmar or Ger, but a chassid is a person who goes beyond the halacha. The difference between a tzaddik and a chassid is a tzaddik, a righteous person, keeps all of the halachas. The chassid goes beyond the halacha, to have a devekas in Hashem. So, Pirkei Avos is the key to what is called chasidus. Now, the Rambam then brings in the famous Brisa, which is actually well known as the foundation of the Mesilas Yesharim. The Mesilas Yesharim, written by the Ramchal, is of course hundreds and hundreds of years after the Rambam. The Rambam was in the 1200s. The Ramchal is in the 16 and 1700s. So Rambam had nothing to do with Ramchal per se, but you'll recall that the Ramchal is based, the whole book of Mesilas Yesharim is based on a long brisa of Rav Pinchas ben Yair, who says this level leads you to this level, and this level leads you to this level. The lowest level is Zehirus, which basically means you keep the whole Torah. That's the lowest level. And then you proceed from there. That's why people sometimes say, like, why am I learning Mesilas Yesharim? I mean, his lowest level is to keep the whole Torah. And then he goes beyond that. I mean, I never get beyond the lowest level. Okay, that itself is an interesting question. The truth is, the levels are not that you can't reach the next one at all till you completely master the lower one, but rather, if you do a little bit of the lower, you can do a little bit of the higher, meaning to say, even before you totally master, you can get some type of kinyan of each level on some level. But towards the end there, one of the highest levels, and the Mesilas Yesharim has several prakim on this, is called chasidus. And from chasidus, you come to ruach hakodesh. So the Rambam says the following. He connects the two Gemaras. If the Gemara in Bava Kama tells us that Pirkei Avos brings you to chasidus, you want to be a chassid, and the Gemara in Avodah Zarah, Rav Pinchas ben Yair says, chasidus brings you to ruach hakodesh. So in other words, Pirkei Avos can bring you to ruach hakodesh, which in turn, the Rambam treats in this context as synonymous to Nevuah. Nevuah, this mamish ties into Shmuel ibn Tibon. Nevuah is the highest form of Yedias Hashem that a human being is capable of. A direct experience of divine revelation and connection with the Almighty. So now you see the logical connection here. If midos ros are mechitzos that prevent Yedias Hashem, and when I remove the mechitzos, I become capable of Yedias Hashem. That's the same thing as saying, Pirkei Avos brings me to the madrega of Chasidus. Chasidus brings me to the madrega of Ruach HaKodesh, and Nevuah. Technically, Ruach HaKodesh is not the same as Nevuah, but the Rambam is understanding all of them as a direct experience of God. Again, the Rambam is going with the idea that Tikkun HaMidos, we're not looking at it in terms of what you're doing for other people, we're looking at it for what you're doing for your own neshama to become Mizdabek Ba'Kadosh Baruch Hu. So as I said, I think Rav Shmuel Ibn Tibon and the Rambam kind of are on the same page for this, which is why the Rambam wanted him to be his translator, because they're both looking at Midos as an eifin of Yedias Hashem, Haskel, V'yadua, Aisi. Now then the Rambam says a very interesting point, which is actually very, very interesting. He says that when I explain Pirkei Avos, and when I go through the 8 prakim, I will be quoting from many, many philosophers, Jewish and non-Jewish, Aristotle mainly. But he says, I will not be quoting them by name. And indeed, this is kind of a habit of the Rambam. The Rambam almost never says, this person says this person says this. And it's a little odd, because after all, don't Chazal always say, you should always say things b'shem omro, in the name of the person who said it. Like when Esther told Achashverosh, or told Achashverosh or Achashverosh's men, that Bigsan Viserys were planning on assassinating him. So she got the news from Mordechai, and the Torah and the Navi emphasizes she said it in the name of Mordechai. And that's why Mordechai was written down for reward. And from here we learn out, Kol ha'omer davar b'shem amro, mevi geula liolam. That brings redemption, b'shem amro. So machlekes, do you have to say intermediary statements? Let's assume, for example, that I saw in Rabbi Kiva Eger that he brought something in the name of the Zohar. Can I just say the Zohar says? Or do I have to say Rabbi Kiva Eger says in the name of the Zohar? That's machlokas. Do you have to give intermediate links? Some say you do for another reason, not because of Shem Amro, but because it looks like a gaiva. Because if I say, oh, the Zohar says, people are going to say, oh, he knows the Zohar. But if I say, I saw Rabbi Kiva Eger brings the Zohar, so at least you know I saw it. In fact, sometimes not Rabbi Kiva Eger, it might be Art Scroll brings the name of whatever, so you should be honest and not make the impression that you know all of these Makoros. Talking to myself as well, when in fact we got it from a second or third hand. But okay, Beseder. But the Rambam violates this rule. The Rambam, he tells you up front, I'm violating. I'm not going to tell you who said it. And he gives a very interesting reason. A very interesting reason. He says, because I'm going to tell you who said it, and then if you think the author is treif or whatever it is, you're just going to dismiss it without thinking about the idea. And since I want you to give an idea serious thought and not dismiss it, I'm not going to tell you the source. And then he says, and I'm not a plagiarist because I'm telling you ahead of time that some of what I say is from other people. Meaning, if I would just say it without telling you, it might be from other people, I might be a ganef. But the Rambam says, I am making an announcement that a lot of things I'm saying might be from other sources, but I'm not going to mention those other sources because I don't want you to dismiss an idea based on where it comes from. Now, presumably, I'm assuming that that's almost an admission that this will be from non-Jewish sources, because if all of his sources were from Chazal, what is he afraid of? That a religious Jew is going to dismiss Chazal? But he meant, if he would say Aristotle, he would say Plato, people would say, Geisha stuff, I don't want to listen to it. So he says, I'm not going to tell you my sources. It's a very interesting cheshbon. Now, the Rambam makes the point the other way too, though. The Rambam actually says that you shouldn't always evaluate an idea because of how choshev the person was. He says, the Rambam says every idea should be evaluated based on how correct it is, and you don't say, oh, this person said it, so it got to be correct, and the like. It's like they tell, I remember Maisa once stuff. Somebody wanted to teach a niggin to a group of people. And the niggin wasn't really very exciting, and nobody really caught on to it, whatever. They weren't that interested in it. So then the person said afterwards, do you know who wrote the niggin? So people say, who cares? He says, this was the Ger Tzedek of Vilna that was being led to his death on Shavuos. And the Vilna Gaon took the niggin and taught it to Rav Chaim of Volozhin, and this was sung in the Volozhin yeshiva. So all of a sudden everybody said, can you sing it again? Like sometimes when we know where it's from, all of a sudden, it's a really chashuv thing. So the Rambam wouldn't agree with that. The Rambam would say, hey, it's either good or it's not good. You don't need to know where it's from and how it's from. So it's still a kasha that the Rambam is contradicting the Gemara. Right? The Gemara says you're supposed to say b'shem amra. Okay, that's a kasha taka. But the Rambam held that sometimes it's better not to give you sources for everything because you might dismiss where it comes from. And here the Rambam makes the famous statement. I'm not sure if he originated this. This is a famous phrase. Kabel ha'emet mimi sha'amra. Accept the truth from whatever source it comes from. This is actually a famous expression. I'm not sure if it originated from the Rambam or the Rambam said it elsewhere. In fact, I'll tell you a story, an amazing story. I have a feeling it may not be true, but I'll tell you the story anyway. Rav Hai Gaon, who was the greatest of the Gaonim. Rav Hai Gaon was the last of the Gaonim, the greatest of the Gaonim. Apparently his yeshiva was right across the street from a monastery, whatever it was. And they're learning Tanakh, and they had a difficult pasuk, how to translate the pasuk in Tanakh, and Zechariah, different. So Rav Hai Gaon said to one of his talmidim, go across the street and see how they learn the pasuk over there. I mean, go to the monastery. They all knew Hebrew and see how the Catholics, interpret this verse. So the student, he couldn't process this. He was dumb. He was just sitting there, So I said, "What's the matter? You think you can't learn from the Goyim too?" He says, "Go across the street, talk to them. Maybe their pshat is totally wrong. Maybe it's right. We can, And the story goes that Rav Hai Gaon said this same lashon, "Kabel ha'emes mimi sha'amrei." Go and ask how they learn, etc. Right? So you never know. The truth is, a barbanel sometimes brings Christian interpretations. He often, as you would expect, is cholek on them legamri, often. But sometimes he says, as a matter of language, he's willing, just in terms of translations of words and the like, he's willing to accept how they translate words. The Karaites are another example. The Karaim are kaifrim in Torah Shabbal Peh, right? So of course, apikorsim kfira. But their specialty was Tanakh. That's all they did. So as a result, the Ibn Ezra, the Abarbanel, they say when it comes to grammar, comes to dicta, comes to translation, he says we could sometimes even take from them. Not in the Yanim of halacha, not hashkafa, not a philosophy of life, not musar, but in their particular mitzvah, he says, it was shayach sometimes to even take from them. So that's what the Rambam is saying here. Kabel ha'emes mimi sha'amrei.